Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this week for another Nerdy Shop Talk.
Yeah.
We've got Julie Dirksen is my co-host. Julie and I, and I'm Tracy Parrish, we have found that some of the best conversations we have when we go to different training events are those side conversations that we have that are in the hallways and in the coffee shops, and just as we're getting ready for sessions to start. So we thought Nerdy Shop Talk was the perfect opportunity for others to listen in on some of those conversations that we're having, where we're talking with other industry experts about different topics and just sort of getting their input on those things. So Julie, would you like to introduce our guest today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to talk about self-directed learning. And, there's all sorts of interesting things in there around learner motivation and what people's skills are and all of those kinds of things. But my dog has decided that somebody just got home, and so she's very excited about that. But she'll stop in a moment. So sorry about that. But anyway, the person we really thought would be great to talk to on this topic is Catherine Lombardozzi, who's really one of those lovely evidence-based practitioners who spends a lot of time looking through journal articles, which is something that also makes me happy. But particularly has done a lot on kind of what do we need to really think about for self-directed learning, and did a great research report for the Learning Guild. Was that last year or 2 years ago? That weird time is
it was in 2019 or 2020.
2020. Okay. Did a research report on self-directed learning for the Learning Guild, which we'll put that link in the show notes. But welcome and thanks for joining us, Catherine.
Thank you. I've been telling people that during the pandemic years, I was working on self-directed learning because that's what it feels like. The last 2 years have been a lot about self-directed learning. So.
And I think we've got some new people. So if you haven't joined us before, usually what the format is we'll do the chat amongst ourselves, but we're happy and delighted to have questions in the chat. And if you really are like, no, I just want to talk to you, let us know. You can raise your hand and we're happy to unmute for user questions and things like that too. We generally kind of keep everybody muted more because of dogs and background noise and all that kind of fun stuff. But Catherine, we usually start with the something else other than learning, the intro question, which is, what's something other than learning related topics that you're nerdy about?
I think I'm nerdy about writing.
Okay.
I have a whole shelf of books about writing, and I follow some novelists and am enthralled by the way they work. So that kind of thing just intrigues me. I get all worked up. So
nice. Yeah, I actually love like podcasts and stuff about story structure and novel writing, even though I don't really ever want to write a novel. I've decided that that's not my jam. Elizabeth is saying that she's nerdy about power tools, which I think sounds amazing.
Yeah.
So good for her.
If there's something in the
audience, talk on that.
If you're in our audience and there's something, other than learning, also in addition to learning that you're nerdy about, put it in the chat. We'd totally love to know what those are. Anyway, just to get started, kind of we wanted to make sure that the title of this about the myth of the lazy learners. I think we've all had the experience where, at some point you're having a conversation with a stakeholder or client about the importance of like, how are we going to motivate people to take the learning? And also how are we going to motivate people to do the thing that we're hopefully, creating the learning for. And I know I've had this happen any number of times, at least a handful of times. And I think I'm not the only person where at some point some stakeholder says, well, they're just lazy. They're lazy. And we need to motivate them, and they need to be more motivated about their own learning and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh boy, I really think, first of all, how did you hire all the lazy people? Because I don't know any lazy people. Everybody I know is super busy. And that might be an issue with your hiring processes. I don't know. But second of all, I'm like, it's more complicated than that. So what's your answer to that one, Catherine, when people are trying to tell you that learners are just lazy about their own learning?
I think my take is that it's another example of blaming the employees for problems that are systematic. I think that when people don't pursue self-directed projects, it's because they're not given the time or the attention, reward, so to speak, for doing that kind of work on their own. And I think that's the biggest problem when I talk to people and they get stalled on their self-directed learning projects, or they can't seem to figure out how to move something along. It's because they're scheduled for 120% of their working hours, and there just isn't time in there. And it's, if they have other things to do outside of their working hours that have, more impact or more importance to them than a learning project might be. Although they might have learning projects that are outside their work that they're gung-ho about, something like, learning woodworking or learning and a musical instrument or something like that. It's not like people don't pursue those things, because they do. They just need the time and the interest to do it.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. I was doing workshops for Google for a while for their Googlers Teach Googlers group. I was doing instructional design workshops because they had a lot of people that were in the organization where training was their job, but then they also had a lot of people, and I can never remember, I think it was 10% time, it was 10 or 20% time at Google where you could pursue your own projects. And they took that pretty seriously. And so I would have people who would show up and take a full day workshop on instructional design just because they were curious, and it's like, hey, guess what? If you actually make space and time for that, there are people who will turn up for it. So
absolutely. It seems unfortunate that in learning and development, a lot of people are trying to enable a self-directed learning culture, right? Because they can't address all the needs. So they really want people to pursue the learning that they need for themselves. And at the same time, they're not giving them time to do it. It's easy to schedule when it's a course, or, when you have to free people up to go to their half-day training or whatever. But for some reason, we're just reluctant to say we're going to allocate 2 hours a week or a half a day a month or whatever time you can give, but something to allow people to pursue their projects inside of working hours.
Yeah, Ellen also has a great point. So being able to share that learning back, just showing the show and share of what you've used and how you've applied it and where it maybe can come back into the workplace. So besides time and maybe that option of showing it back, are there other supports that need to be in place to really make self-directed learning more robust or stick?
Yeah, I think that when I did the research for the Learning Guild report on scaffolding self-direction, there were 6 things. The 2 of them we've already just mentioned. You need to give them time, and you need to give some level of management engagement, which doesn't mean, by the way, that managers take over that, but it does mean that they give it attention, that they care about those projects, they ask about them, they get barriers out of the way, they show an interest, and they reward people to some degree for achieving learning and for having deepened their skills in some fashion. So those were 2 of them. The other 4 were, you definitely want to give employees control over their learning. And which means you don't have to track a lot of it. You just don't need to put a lot of rules and regulations around it. You want to give them as much freedom as you can, to give them curated resources. So looking in your organization for those skill sets that are on the development plans for a large number of people, and making sure you've already done some curation for them, giving them recommendations for the kinds of resources that might be useful to them. That's an important piece of it. Helping people to make interpersonal connections. So connecting them with mentors or subject matter experts or others who can be helpful to them in their learning projects. And then a little bit of support for learning to learn. We were talking before the webinar started about the fact that we've learned in our schooling, most of us in our schooling, that somebody else structures that for us. And so if you tell us go out and learn, that's all well and good, but how do you do that besides reading a book or watching a video? What are the other things that you should do? And we know as designers that you have to put some activities around that, but normal everyday people don't necessarily have that skill. So organizations are helping people to notice, these are the things that can help you to learn. These are the things that can help you to make sure that you're applying what you're learning to what you're doing. And that's been really useful in a lot of organizations.
I feel like maybe, we need to have like self-directed learning Sherpas or something, somebody who will help you, like sort of sit down and go, let's just scaffold this a little bit. Let's just,
That'd be great.
what do you want to do? How do you want to develop? What kinds of things are you interested in? Because I do think this question of people having some control and autonomy over it, and that is such a push-pull, right, in organizations. I was talking to somebody at a conference for healthcare workers, and they were saying these healthcare workers don't take initiative. And I'm like, yeah, but you've also spent a big part of the day talking about how much control you need to apply to make sure that they're doing everything exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, and I'm like, so initiative and self-direction and control and top-down direction, like those two things, control versus initiative, like those two things are going to fight with each other, right? Like they're,
Mm-hmm.
and her head just about exploded while I was standing there watching her, right? She was just like, literally like, oh, the more we control what they do, the less they're going to take initiative. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have any controls. I mean, obviously this is healthcare. You get stuff wrong, people will get hurt or die, like that's real bad. Mm-hmm. And so you do need some controls, but and one of the things I always talk about when I talk about like fostering learner attention, which is kind of related to this, right? But is only lock down the things you have to. Mm-hmm. Do you have to force the path that people go through this? If you do, okay, sometimes that's necessary. It really does build on one each other, and if they jump around, it's going to be bad. But like as a default, anytime you don't have to lock down order, don't. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a client company that has what we would traditionally call a tuition reimbursement program that is so open. It's surprising to me. It kicks in very soon after people are come on board, and they pay for all kinds of things, not just matriculated in a college or university, but do you want to go to a conference? Do you want to go to a session outside of the organization where they're doing a workshop on something? Do you want us to buy you a book? There's
Wow.
all kinds of freedom in their tuition reimbursement it's not tuition, in their reimbursement program, that really allows people the freedom to choose the things that they want to do. Now, I'm sure there's some approvals inside the organization that I'm not aware of, but just the fact that it's open that way, I think is really helpful, because that's the way a lot of people learn. They don't need to matriculate. There are other things that cost money that can be really helpful to people.
Yeah. Well, and I know some places where it's like, you want to use it to go take a cake decorating class, we're okay mm-hmm. with that. Like it's literally that open. Mm-hmm. Or I've years ago I worked at Allen Interactions, and they had a sabbatical benefit that actually came from Michael had gone to Google, and he really thought that was cool, and so they'd added this, and you had to kind of make some really loose connection to the work you were doing,
right?
But it could be very loose. Like they were very generous with, and I don't know if they still do that or not, but they were very generous with kind of letting you, like as long as you could make any kind of reasonable case,
right? Make a case, and you should be able to make a case, right? I mean, that's a fair request to me. Yeah. Make mm-hmm. your case, and if you make a good case, we'll support you in that. And I do think it's useful to then say, when you're done, we'd love you to make a presentation to your team about what you've learned, mm-hmm. Or I'd like to hear about it. Nothing big and formal that makes things crazy, but just an acknowledgement that you've now gained some skill or gained some knowledge that you can then share with the rest of the people who work in the organization.
Mm-hmm. And so you talked about this, but what are from your point of view, the really crucial capabilities that they need to have in order, like the idea that people need to learn certain things in order to be good self-directed learners, I thought was really one of my big takeaways from the research report and things like that. So what and how do you feel like people develop some of those capabilities?
Well, I called it the wherewithal in the research report. So what's the wherewithal you have to have as a learner if you're going to be good at it? And there were 6 things. I don't know why they were both 6, but there were 6 things in the wherewithal section. And the wherewithal was, one, you have to be motivated to learn and learn the thing that you're studying. Motivation is not something that's a global characteristic. It has to do with what you are trying to study. So you have to be motivated to learn that particular thing. You need to be good at assessing your own skill level, both just to have identified it as a need, but also as you're developing yourself to be able to assess whether you're making progress. So you have to be effective at that. You need some level of resourcefulness and planning skills to be able to find the resources that you need and organize yourself so that you can actually get that done. You need learning skills. That's kind of what we talked about earlier. And I did a presentation a few weeks ago and I said, so what is this thing we call learning skills? And I looked it up on the internet and I didn't like what I saw. So I made a list for myself, but it's things like, can you manage your own attention? Can you figure out how to observe somebody and learn from that? You know, can you create job aids for yourself or practice activities for yourself? Those are the learning skills that you need to have if you're going to be self-directed. And then the last one was self-efficacy, which is just belief that you can learn that way. You know, so many people will just push off and say, you can't learn that through self-directed learning. And my position has always been, you can learn anything you want through self-directed learning.
Mhm.
If you really want to do it, you can do it. You know, you can connect with people, you can find the resources, there's all kinds of things you can do. You can learn anything. Some of it's a lot harder to learn through self-directed learning, I'll give you that, but it's not that it's not possible.
You mentioned motivation, and we had a discussion last night on Learn Chat about whether reward was a necessary part of learning, and whether that was just getting a certificate or getting a badge, or wondering what your thoughts are on that when you're talking about motivation as well. Is it just an internal motivation, or was your experience with getting those little badges for things?
I saw little snatches of that chat when I was in Twitter last night. I think intrinsic reward is the best, right? Your own feeling of, okay, I feel really good now that I know this better and I can use it better. So I think that's the best rewards. But when you're in a work context, I think it's really important to have those things recognized. I think people get really disheartened when they work really hard to learn something and they know that they've improved skill and none of that is being commented on by their managers or by the people that they work with. That's just very disheartening. And so I think that you do need a little bit of that for people to feel that little extra jolt of, yeah, I am making progress here. It's not just me. I'm not the only one who thinks so. In fact, you know, there are other people who are seeing it.
Yeah, well, just those opportunities for teach backs too, right?
And it's easy not to see your progress on these things. You know, like it's easy not to feel like, I mean, you know, if I'm learning something new and I'm, you know, like I look at like the Duolingos or something like that, like I've been working with, not Duolingo, but I've been trying to learn some conversational Lithuanian, which is not a thing you hear every day. Yeah, I know, right? So, and unfortunately, Duolingo does not have a Lithuanian track, but I found a different app that does. But just being able to be like, ooh, knocking stuff off or seeing some completion, or just this sort of feeling like I'm moving ahead, and it tells you how many words you've added to your vocabulary and stuff like that. So it's not so much like do this and we give you a cookie. It's more like just this feeling of satisfaction of look how far I've come or something like that. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, I have what I did after the finishing the report was I created a set of resources I call Charting Your Course, which is helping people to go through that self-directed learning process. And at the beginning, it's a stage called orientating, where you're setting goals. But one of the things that I tell people to do in the orientating phase, there's 3 things. 1, set the goal, or the general what you're looking for. 2, make sure you know why. So articulate your why, because you're going to need that motivation in front of you to keep going. And then the 3rd is figure out where you are and where you want to be, so you've got something to measure yourself against. So in the absence of anybody else telling you, or some sort of external tool that you can use to measure your progress, think about whatever knowledge or skill base you're looking at on a continuum from novice to expert, I know nothing to, I'm an expert in the thing. And on a scale of 1 to 10, in between those two endpoints, where do you think you are now? And where do you want to be at the end of this self-directed learning project? And that way, when you get to what I call the waypoint, when you get through a certain number of activities that you think you've put together to try to make progress, you can stop and say, have I moved from where I was to anywhere closer to where I wanted to be? Or have I in fact reached where I wanted to be? And maybe I can start looking at a different self-directed learning project. So I do think people like to have some sort of a stake in the ground, so to speak, to measure themselves against. And in the absence of anything else more complicated, that's a simple way that people can do that.
Yeah, because I mean, if we're pronouncing your name wrong, please let us know. Badges and rewards and all that kind of stuff. Like, we know that there's been about a bunch of bad implementations of that, but I do think there's something about being able to be like, I'm ticking off progress towards my goal, and that is more intrinsic. Like, I've got this goal. I also think there's an interesting thing in goal setting, which is kind of interesting from a self-directed learning point of view, which is learning not to project out too far. I've done some work with Michelle Seager, who Tracy, we should totally get on here sometime. But she does stuff on exercise motivation, and she finds that like the goal that's way out in the future, right? I'm going to get in shape, right? That's a goal that people might have. First of all, what does that even mean? But second of all, like, that's never a short-term proposition. Anybody who's saying I need to get in shape, it's not like, as opposed to here's what I'm going to do this week, or here's what I'm going to do in the next 10 days or something like that. And so like there's probably a skill to that goal setting too, of having some, even if you've got a big picture goal that you're working your way towards, having some really nice, immediate, achievable things again, so you're sort of ticking off that progress, or something that's meaningful. And I think learning to set those for yourself, because to Aham's point about the like bad use of badges, my favorite example of that is I have an Audible account. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, mostly while I walk the dog or something like that. And for a long time, it was either like mystery novels or professional books. But the only way I got through some of the big, some of these like Thinking Fast and Slow or something like that, was the fact that I could listen to it, while I did other things, and make, sort of double use of that time. But they have badges in the Audible app that are things like, you've listened to, 10 or 50 hours of audiobooks. And I'm like, you know what? That's not a meaningful goal to me. Like, I'm not really going for 50. Like, it's not a thing, right? It might be like, oh, I listened to 10 behavioral economics books. That's exciting. Like, that's something that's actually related to what I'm trying to do, or 10 behavioral science books or something like that. Like, but the 50 hours, and they were like, you get a badge for listening a lot on the weekend. And I'm like, what is that?
But then sometimes not having the opportunity to show those badges off is problematic. But then you also go, do I want people to know that I've listened to all that? I want everybody to see my 10 badges, but do I want them to know it's all about cupcakes? I'm not sure.
Yeah, exactly. I think there is a little bit to the idea of checking things off a list, though. In doing working with people on self-directed learning projects, having a plan that has very specific things on it that you can say, I have completed some things, on the way to feeling like I've made that goal. I think that does help people feel somewhat of a sense of accomplishment and forward motion, unless and until they're actually feeling it in the knowledge base and skill set.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's absolutely something. So like the exercise example, it's you might have exercise for months before you notice that, oh, it's easier for me to climb stairs or something. So before you get that like a noticeable physiological benefit. Right. So having some kind of thing that you're ticking off in the meantime that allows you to measure progress is hugely important for some of that stuff.
So I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here on what we had before, but what do we do about plateauing? How do we get past those moments of plateaus? Yeah, because as you said, just Julie, if you don't see those little things along the way,
Yeah.
you think nothing's happening, right? So whether it's a, you know, a real plateau or something you just are imagining.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm reading a book now called Smart Growth, and I meant to look up who wrote it and I forgot, but she talks about an S curve of learning where when you're at the beginning, things feel really slow. And you're because you're just trying to get your feet wet, figure out what you need to learn, where you need to go. And then that you enter a phase where things are accelerated, which you're really learning a lot and it feels very energizing. And eventually you're going to hit this other plateau where things start to feel really slow again. And that's natural and normal. You know, when you hit the point where you are highly skilled or expert, it doesn't feel like, it may not feel like you're learning a lot because of the nature of where you are. And I think there are two solutions, shall we say, or two options for where to go from there. One is if you are indeed an expert in that thing, then you're at the edge of where things are and you get to invent the practice going forward, right? So you can push the envelope and that can be very energizing. That is a form of learning as well, for you to kind of be reinventing the way things are done because you're so smart about the thing that you do that you can play with the normal way of doing things and come up with something brand new. So that's one way you can deal with a plateau. The other way you can deal with a plateau is say, yep, I have everything I need. This is enough skill for me to have for the work that I want to do. And I can look at other things and try to find something else that I can get real excited about learning. And gosh knows in our field, there is plenty that you could start over with, you know, and start to learn and accelerate your growth on that could be really exciting and energizing for you while you continue to maintain some level of expertise in the thing that you found yourself to be really good at.
Right. No, that's a really interesting one because I'm debating whether I should even pull this out because I realize I don't have the source on this, but I'm pretty sure I remember reading something about like how the first 1 to 5 years that somebody's a doctor, there's a lot of development in their practice. So, you know, a doctor that's been in practicing for 3 years is better than 1 year, and a doctor who's been practicing 5 years is better than the one at 3 years, you know, just because they get good at their job and they do it every day and they, you know, get smoother and more practice with everything that they're doing. But that the 5-year mark, and I, like I said, please don't quote me on this because I could be misremembering this, but that there's somewhere in the practice, there's this plateau point, right? And so the difference between a doctor that's somebody who's been a doctor 5 years and 10 years is not significantly different. You know, like at a certain point, unless they're deliberately choosing to find ways to challenge themselves and continue to develop, but it's like, you know, if they're just practice, like just the active working in your job and, you know, being competent at it and stuff, kind of like will get to a point where it sort of levels you out. And I would imagine that it depends a little bit on what the nature of the job is and stuff like that. You know, and if you're a family practitioner, you're doing mostly the same thing every day, right? You know, I mean, obviously you get some curveball cases and stuff like that, but by and large, you're doing checkups and you're doing, you know, dealing with kind of more mundane illnesses and all of those kinds of things. And so that there's, you know, so people can kind of basically sit there and be, and it's not that they're necessarily bad doctors at that point, but like there's not necessarily, you know, 20 or 30 years making them significantly better than they were at the 5-year mark and things like that. And so that's an interesting one because I think that so much of what we do in learning and development is about getting beginners started. And there's just this enormous amount of opportunity in the, once you're a nice solid intermediate, moving you up a level, but that's, so my theories behind this, and I'll be interesting what you say about it. My theory behind it is that that's harder to, you know, it's just harder to do. And this person's operating okay. And it's easier to just let it run is part one of that. But my part two of that is that the needs of that particular learner to kind of continue to go up, to get very individual. So it's not as easy as just sort of saying, we're going to have a program for everybody who's at the 5-year mark in their career.
Yeah, I think that's true. What I have a framework I call learning curves that talks about that when you're new, you need a lot of structured learning and support. because there's just a lot of learning that is communicating what is already known about that subject. But the more expert you get, the further you get to the highest levels of expertise, what you need then is doing the work. So the more you actually have to do the work, you're constantly learning and doing the work and interacting with other experts. So you kind of push each other and really encourage each other to push the envelope of whatever the work might be. So those are the two things that I think become really important as learning exercises at that high level of expertise. So you're right, that's a whole different structure or way to think about your learning, and not a lot of us know how to make that happen if that's not naturally happening. If I feel like I'm an expert in something and I work as an independent consultant alone in my office, what am I going to do to put myself in the position where I'm interacting with others who have the same kind of expertise, or getting out and really pushing the frontier of what we do. When you were talking about the doctor, I was thinking about, I wonder if there's a difference between a general practitioner who gets a lot of the same thing over and over again, and someone who's a cancer specialist, for example, whose area of expertise is constantly changing, and he can't or she can't stay at that level. They're going to have to continuously be tuned into what's going on. So they're the experts that have to keep pushing the envelope and keep themselves energized.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously the technologies and the practices around treating cancer have evolved enormously, and certainly in my adult lifetime, I've seen
absolutely
huge differences in how that goes about. So presumably there are jobs that sort of force it on you more than others, or I don't even know if force it on you is really the right phrase. There's certain jobs that just require it. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Well, and I kind of always keep a hand in around consulting projects. Like I mean, most of my business is kind of shifted towards workshops or speaking or, things like that. But I'm always very wary of not doing real work.
I know what you mean.
Just because I had to learn, we had to really do like a solid mobile platform, or I had to deal with, this issue or that issue. And I like the fact that those things kind of force me outside of some of my comfort places and things like that.
Yeah, I wrote the report in 2020, and since then I've had opportunity to do workshops on self-directed learning, but more importantly, I've done that Sherpa stuff. Like I've actually been working one-on-one with people to help them to develop their self-directed learning plans. And boy, have I learned a lot in that, just about how people think and what their challenges are and what they know and don't know how to do as just, run as professionals in other fields besides ours, right? What do they really bring to the table? It's been very, very enlightening to work with them.
So on that, what sort of types of self-directed learning are you seeing? Is it, like we mentioned before, it might not just be reading a book or taking a course.
Right.
Like, what are you seeing in some of those Sherpa sessions?
Yeah, well, in those sessions, I find that there are three sort of categories of learning project. That was one thing that really came to the forefront. So there are the projects that were what I was initially thinking about, which is deep dive on one subject. If you're upskilling or reskilling and you have to learn something and not very much about it and you need to come up to speed really fast. That's one kind of learning project, and that's easy to try to sketch out. Another type of learning project is more of those long-term professional development or continuous professional development things. So I want to be a better writer, or I want to be I want to develop my team better, or have more engagement on my team. Yeah, you can learn some key concepts, pretty quickly, but actually learning enough to do that effectively is something that you have to pay attention to over a much longer time frame. So the shape of that kind of a self-directed project looks very different. And then the third one is the thing that I call spot learning, which is basically, like one person came to me and said, I need to know how to create charts in Excel. I'm like, well, that's not it's self-directed, but go look up, a course or a tutorial on the thing that you need to do and you're done. You don't need to make this big elaborate learning project out of that. What he really needed was learning analytics.
Right. There's a YouTube video, I promise. There's one that will explain that. Yeah.
Right. Right. So those were the different kinds of projects that I saw, and the way you organize learning for each of those is very different. And spot learning, you don't create a big project for.
So do you help them out along, so for those instances you've had, do you keep helping them out along the way, or do you just kind of help them with the plan and let them go off and do it on their own?
Yeah.
And if they're coming back to you, what kind of challenges are you seeing with those? What challenges are they facing, I guess?
Yeah, the service that's being paid for is the former, right? My job is to just help them to get the project and to have a plan. And when they have the plan, they're basically done. But in practice, actually, the way it's landed is I contract for 3 meetings. The first one is orientating. The second one is wayfinding, which is coming up with the plan. And then the third one is to talk about the journeying, which is the learning part. And originally that was conceptualized as, before you go off and start doing this, let's talk about how you're going to make sure you're learning your learning skills, that sort of thing. But now it's turned into, why don't you start your plan and come back in a month and tell me how it's going, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those meetings have been very helpful to people, because that's where I ask questions like, how are you taking notes? How are you going back to those things? How are you doing and applying what you're learning to the work? What are the strategies you're using to make sure you can do that? It's all well and good to go through the activities and the inputs, the books or videos or courses that we said you wanted to pursue. But if you're not going to apply it, then you're not going to feel like you made progress on this project. So let's make sure you go that way. So I do think that step needs as much attention as the how do you create a project. But don't underestimate how well people know how to create a project, because they don't. They have no idea.
Right. Well, and I mean, just this, I'm thinking about habits of how you approach stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, I kind of collect models around, whatever. But I'm interested in models. So Howard Barrows and the original problem-based learning in medical education, right? And they had, I'm probably going to get these wrong, but they would he would sit down and he'd say, a patient walks into your clinic and she said she had a fall 2 weeks ago, but she's been fine since then. But this morning she woke up and she's been numb from her knees down, and she's also got some dizziness and, whatever. What do you do next? And they would track on a board, what do you know? What are hypotheses? What do I need to find out? And then they'd sort of assign responsibilities and what do I need to find out? And that this was this structure or habit of thinking around something. And I'm also thinking of Dan Meyer, who does math education, and he talks about how most math is how do you solve the problem, right? But he has a whole thing around what questions. He's when you use math in the real world, in the wild, it's not about how do you solve the problem, it's about what questions do you even ask about the situation. How do you identify what you know? How do you identify what you don't know? How do you structure the problem? How do you figure out what math you use to apply to the problem? And then how do you solve the problem? And his argument is that we're starting at step, 8 or 9 or whatever that is, of the process of really using math in the real world. And you need to back up. And so he'll do things like videos of somebody shooting baskets, and he'll freeze it. And he'll be what question, with the basket, with the ball up here. And then, what are even the questions, and the questions are is the basket going to go in? Is the ball going to go in the basket? How do you calculate it? What's the curve? Whatever. And then he'll go through that process with students. And so it feels to me like there's something around that. And I mean, this is typically learned in kind of an innate way. I think I'm good at self-directed learning. I think I'm a good self-directed learner. But if I had to actually break down, what do I do? And I have certain habits oh, that's an interesting article, I should hang on to that. And at some point I may actually put it into a presentation, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to look at all my resources in this, and then I'm going to go do a deeper dive into that article than just skimming through the abstract. And then eventually I'm going to use collect all this stuff together for this. And so having having really deliberate kind of practices of thought or practices of effort around these things? I don't know where I'm going with this, but
No, I think it's an important question, because, you know, in that first meeting, when I one of the questions I asked people is, when you need to learn something, what are some of the things that you do? You know, do you journal? Do you have a notebook? What do you do? And people will, you know, sometimes they'll show me a notebook. Sometimes they'll say, look, you know, look at all the sticky notes I have all over my office or whatever, which is useful, but not necessarily going to remind you of the thing that you need to do at the time you need to do it. So we talk about more concrete ways to keep track of what it is that you're learning, so that you are actually going to be able to use it going forward. Because people do too often, way too often, and I am just as bad at this as other people, is you read a book and it's got some really cool ideas in it, and you never actually implement those ideas, you know, because you never sat down and said, what does this mean to me? And how am I going to change the way I behave or the things that I do with regard to this thing going forward? And how am I going to make sure that I remember to do that going forward? You know, because I don't always have to do that thing, whatever it is. All of those are habits of learning that most people don't have. And we try to integrate that sort of thing into instructional design, right? When you do a workshop, if it's an in-depth workshop, you're going to have discussion, you're going to have action planning, you're going to have practice activities or simulations, right? That's why we do those things. And that's not available to people when they're self-directing. So that they've got to be able to create those opportunities for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I have a peer who just shared a simple document that he takes to conferences or sessions that he goes to. And the document is just, David Gilbert shared it with me. And it's just 3 things I learned in this session and 3 things I want to go take action on.
Mm-hmm.
And he takes that away from every session so that he has those actionable items to go in, at least practice what he's discovered in that session. Yeah. Whether it's just researching something else or looking up more information. I think that's a handy tool to sort of have.
That's great. No, and I like the simplicity of it too. I think that's really nice.
Yeah.
So.
I think that's the big thing is I have notebooks of after going to events. I'm like, here's, as you said, here's all the hundreds of things I want to do. And I get back to my desk and I'm like, oh, I got 600 emails. I guess that's what I'm doing.
Right. That's what you're going to do. Yeah. I have a similar practice to your colleague, because I usually have a notebook, but on the back page in the notebook is the to-dos. So I just keep a running list of to-dos. Like, what do I want to do with this stuff when I get back, so that a week after I get back, when I get through all my emails, I can go back and say, what was I going to follow up on? What was I going to do? What of this really jolted me and said, gosh, you really need to dig into that more deeply.
Yeah. Julie, you had a comment about the virtual impact, but I'm unsure what you meant by that. So I actually need you to clarify that one.
I've got one for that, but before I dig into that one, I just want to remind everybody, if you're listening and you have questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. If you'd like to ask out loud, just you do the hand raise, and we're happy to encourage people to unmute and ask questions and stuff like that. So what I meant by that, there have been some
terrific comments in chat, so I just want to acknowledge that.
Great stuff going on over there. The virtual question. So okay, one of the benefits, I think, of taking a college class, of going to a workshop, whatever, is it gives you a little sandbox away from the distractions of the real world, and makes that, I don't have to constantly be monitoring my email or whatever. And I mean, granted, we take our phones with us everywhere now, so to a certain extent you bring the real world with you, but like part of what formal learning can actually do for you, formal learning where you go to a different physical space for stuff, is to kind of create that protected environment so that you have a social obligation to really engage in the learning, and also literally we've just kind of muffled some of the distractions of the outside world for learning the thing. The switch of everything to virtual has absolutely rammed a hole through that distraction filter. I think, I mean, the protections of distractions, like you we're doing this right now and I'm pretty focused on you because I got a camera on and I'm talking to you. But like, if I'm the person who's sort of lurking in the back listening to this, I might also be like working on a project or doing my email or, whatever. And clearly everybody who showed up here has showed up because they're self-directed learners about self-directed learning, which rah, go everybody. Yeah, well done. But the fact is because it's a virtual environment, because we're on Zoom, because of all of those kinds of things, we still have all of the noise, sitting right outside the Zoom screen that you're looking at. And that's not a judgment if somebody else is doing this, listening to this while they're paying attention to something else. I've done that many, many times. But is there something about that? Like, is there something that we need to take into consideration around losing that ability to kind of protect that time for learning if it's self-directed, and ways we can help people with it, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I guess my initial reaction is we haven't lost the ability to protect that time. We just have transferred the responsibility for protecting that time to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you have to shut off things if you're going to read a book. You have to, that is a choice that you make, to listen to to have your email ping you every time something happens, or to have your webinar up on one side of your screen and your email up on the other side of the screen. That's distracting. I mean, it's perfectly obvious, but it's either important that you really listen to the webinar, in which case you'll give it your full attention, or you're multitasking, and which is not a true thing, but you're switching back and forth and you're going to lose something out of the webinar that you're getting. So it's all a choice. You have to choose to protect that time. It's like what Cal Newport talks about, deep work. And he says the same thing. There's all these distractions, and yet what we really need is time to concentrate on our work. Well, then shut off all the distractions, close the office door, do whatever it is you need to do. And I know that's a lot easier said than done in many instances. Truthfully, it's a lot easier said than done when we put people in a classroom in an organization, right? How many times have you been teaching a workshop and had somebody get pulled out to take a phone call or not come back from a break, for 10 minutes late because they had to go deal with something at work? All those pulls are always there. So we have to make choices about where we're going to put our energy in order to to move our own knowledge and skill base forward.
So I'm interested in, as a sort of follow on this with too, where are the limitations of self-directed learning? Because I do think, I know you said earlier that you were like, you think we can do self-directed learning about anything. And I think that's sort of true, but then I also think there's instances where, so I'll do, for instance, in the early to mid 2000s, I'm super interested in the neuroscience piece, right? And my kind of conclusions have come around on that one, which is that most of it isn't super helpful to us for applied practitioner purposes. Like, it's interesting, it's cool, I still like learning about it, but it usually doesn't tell us something that we didn't already know from the behavioral science, right? Or the behavioral research and things like that. It just kind of tells us which brain region is engaged for most of it and stuff. But really interested in this topic, read lots of like the popular science books about it, the John Medina's Brain Rules, and like Rich Reichstack. I've got a whole shelf of like neuroscience books and stuff like that. Read a lot about it. Was trying to like wrap my head around it. But in, I want to say 2008, I signed up for a neuroscience of education class at the University of Minnesota. It was an extension class. And we went in there, and the format of the class is he did like maybe 4 lectures over the course of the semester. But then we were reading neuroscience journal papers. And the way that it would work is each week, there would be 3 papers, 3 people would take them, go really read them, and then like kind of do a quick summary in about 10 or 12 PowerPoint slides of the paper and bring it back to class. And granted, I got one, I wound up going the first week, which maybe was a bad choice because he admitted at the beginning of the class, he's like, you're going to be bad at this at first, but you'll get better at it, right? You'll get better at reading these journal articles. It's okay if you're bad at it at the beginning, be okay with that. But I got one that was like linguistics. I hadn't been reading research papers a lot up till then, or certainly not neuroscience ones. And so the stats and some of the format was hard. And then the neuroscience was hard. So I was dealing with the overlapping 3 different domains that were really not areas where I had expertise. I'd taken a linguistics class way back in college, but like hadn't done it in years. And, so the language around that and the language around the stats, specifically stats for neuroscience, and then the neuroscience itself. And that weekend that I was trying to turn that research paper into those 12 slides was easily the hardest cognitive task that I can remember doing in my adult life. And it didn't help that it was like this weird lockdown PDF. So I couldn't actually copy anything out of the PDF. So anything I wanted out of it, I had to just retype. So that made it more complicated. And there may have been crying, I'm just saying. And the only thing that kept me moving was I was going to have to show up in class on Monday night and present this thing. And there's literally no way in the world that in a self-directed environment, I would have persisted with that task. Now, granted, the professor actually admitted to me afterwards, he's like, oh, that was maybe too hard. That paper was maybe too hard for the first week. I'm like, you think? But I don't know that I would have tackled reading neuroscience research journal articles at all, quite frankly. Like, I don't know that there ever would have been a cycle through that. So, and I think there's something about like putting yourself into this situation where you have this accountability. Like this was a totally optional class. I was even auditing it. I wasn't even getting graded in this class. I was auditing the class, but I had this social accountability to the professor who was letting me audit the class, and to also show up and not look stupid in front of my fellow students. And those things were helpful because I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have ever done that under purely self-directed circumstances. So that may be an extreme example, but like, is there still some stuff that maybe, isn't going to be right for self-directed learning is, I guess, the question.
Yeah, I think that when you are very new to a subject matter, it can be hard to structure a self-directed learning project around that because you don't know what you don't know and you don't know what you need to know in order to even get started. So you need an expert to structure something that gets you started. And so that's when even a self-directed project starts with, let me go take a workshop on this. Let me go find a Coursera course that covers this so I can get some expert telling me the basics that I need to know. Oftentimes when I teach graduate classes, when students talk about self-directed learning, they say, well, I'm taking this master's class. I'm like, yeah, well, it's not quite self-directed learning, but it is in that they volunteered, right? They chose to take the master's class, and we talk about, and it is self-directed in that sense, but it's very structured. And if it's the only thing that they do, then they're not being self-directed about their learning in this subject matter. There are other things they're going to want to do past the master's program, past a particular course that will continue their learning in that particular area. But it does certainly do a nice job structuring it from the beginning.
Tracy, did you have anything else? I've got one more that I want to throw out there, but
no, you go ahead.
Oh,
go
okay.
ahead. Yep.
We're
running out of time. So
from an organizational point of view, if I'm working with a team within an organization and we're saying, how do we foster self-directed learning within the organization? How do we make it do some of those systemic things that that help, kind of develop capacity and create opportunity for self-directed learning? What would be your like top 3 things that you would say to a professional like an L&D group who wants to foster it?
1 is give people time for it. 2 is disconnect the individual development planning process in your organization from the performance management process as far apart as you can get them, because having those 2 things connected completely messes up the dynamics of learning. So I think that's an important piece. And then the third is to be, to find ways to give people resources, whether it's, empowering your managers with good training on how they support learning, having a good L&D strategy that creates a learning culture. Well, the L&D strategy doesn't create the learning culture, but you need a learning culture in the organization. So how do you support that and nurture that, I think, is really important. Those are things. I want to go back real quick. There was a comment about when we were talking about, the question before. Carolyn put a point in the chat that said psychomotor learning requires outside observation. And I think that's the other problem we have with self-directed learning, is it can be very difficult to get the feedback that you need, and if you really need feedback, you're going to have to structure that in, or go with something that gives you a more structured set of feedback on what you're learning, because it's very hard for us to really manage that in a lot of ways. And so that could be a stumbling block for self-directed learning as well. I just wanted to agree with that comment.
Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks, Carolyn. That's a really good point, because I think that absent the lack of feedback is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for a lot of this. By the way, Carolyn, I promise I'm going to follow up with you soon about the nerdy shop topic that we talked about. So I will do that at some point.
All right. Well, wrapping up our hour, this has been phenomenal. And as you said, we're all here because we're all interested or improving our self-learning at the moment. We will make sure that we get all the show notes in on our website when we do post this web chat we've had today, so you can come back and look at it. Catherine, maybe you could let us know, what are you working on right now for self-learning, or what's the next thing on your radar for self-learning?
Are there any things you'd like to tell us about? This is also the shameless
there you go, shameless plug.
Yeah, and shameless plug time. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm very interested in manager-led development. This project has really kind of pulled me over there. So I have a new framework I call A Leader's Guide to Developing People. And I am continuing to deep dive in what people are saying about how managers can influence and help people, and what are some of the, for lack of a better term, best practices in that regard. So I'm deep diving in that area. That's where the Smart Growth book came from, and some other books on my bookshelf that I'm trying to get through. So that's one of them. The other is, I do pride myself on knowing the literature, on knowing what's coming out, and I need a better system for monitoring journal articles, like, tables of contents, and seeing what's coming out immediately. So I have made a commitment to myself to make that work this year.
Oh, good.
I know what I want to do, and I've just never done it. And I just want to give that the best try I can, and try to get much better at watching what's coming out in the literature, so I can share it for one and know it for another.
Yeah. Let me know how that goes.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. And I have access to academic databases. It's still hard.
Yeah.
Julie, how about you? What are you self-learning, or is on your radar next?
I am self-learning about, I'm trying to wrestle with the issue of why it's so hard to get a good mobilely responsive e-learning platform that's also easily hooked up to e-commerce and is accessible, so that I can put more course material online. I do have a course online at designbetterlearning.com. And if you've got follow-up questions for things, the Facebook group that Tracy helps me moderate over on Facebook, Design for How People Learn, is a great place to drop in and add questions. We love that. That is wonderful when people do it. So
exactly.
How about you, Tracy?
I am currently just trying to explore more and more about user interfaces and user design, trying to broaden my knowledge on all aspects of that. So I've been finding that fascinating and trying to find all sorts of different places for that.
I probably have thoughts on that, by the way. So.
I think we all have a lot of thoughts on what that really should be, right?
And how about your Canadian e-learning conference?
Yeah. So my shameless plug, I guess, is the Canadian e-learning conference is June 16th and 17th. You can check it out on our website, and it is virtual this year. We were hoping for in person, but we're going to be virtual one more time so everybody can join us. And we hope to see you there too.
Fantastic. They get
All right.
fabulous people at that event, so you should absolutely
Oh,
check it
great.
out. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. This has been really,
Thank you
really
for
lovely.
inviting me. It's very, very fun. Good
Yay.
questions.
Thank
All
you
right.
everyone for
Have
joining
a
us
great
today.
weekend, everybody.
Thanks.
Take care.